November 15th, 1962. Colonel Dutch von der Berg had spent 547 days trying to break Fidel Castro's mind. The CIA's best psychological warfare specialist versus Cuba's most dangerous weapon, his voice. Dutch had interrupted Castro's speeches with sonic weapons, flooded Havana with counter-propaganda, even hired actors to mimic Castro's gestures in humiliating parodies. Then, Castro walked into that Miami safe house, alone, unarmed, and spoke for exactly 3 minutes about a hill in Korea where Dutch left his wounded sergeant behind. Nobody knew about Korea, not the CIA, not Dutch's wife. Nobody. Castro smiled, placed a file on the table, and walked out. Inside that file were 18 years of Dutch's classified reports, with Castro's handwritten notes in the margins. Every strategy Dutch had used, every weakness he'd tried to exploit, every secret he thought he'd buried. The hunter had always been the hunted. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dutch's hands trembled as he opened the file. 25 years of certainty crumbled with each page turn. His own words stared back at him. Operational reports, psychological assessments, personal notes he'd never shared with anyone. But it was Castro's handwriting that made his blood freeze. Neat, precise annotations in blue ink, dissecting Dutch's strategies like a professor grading a student's exam. Subject demonstrates classic projection of unresolved guilt. Castro had written beside Dutch's analysis of Cuban morale. Recommend exploiting abandonment trauma. The room spun. Dutch gripped the table edge, his purple heart suddenly feeling like a weight around his neck, rather than an honor on his chest. Through the safe house window, Miami's skyline blurred as a single question hammered his skull. How long had Castro been inside his head? The sound of footsteps in the hallway snapped him back. 3 quick knocks, the all-clear signal from Agent Morrison. Dutch slammed the file shut, but the damage was done. Every classified operation, every psychological profile he'd built on Castro, every sleepless night he'd spent crafting the perfect mental assault, all of it had been orchestrated by his target. "Sir?" Morrison's voice cracked through the door. "Everything secure?" Dutch couldn't answer. His throat had turned to sandpaper. How do you tell your handler that the enemy just walked into your most secure facility and revealed you've been dancing to his tune for 18 months? How do you explain that the man you were hired to break had been breaking you instead, piece by careful piece? The file contained more than just his reports. Buried between pages of analysis were photographs Dutch had never seen before. Pictures of him in Seoul, 1951. Pictures of Sergeant Kowalski bleeding out on Hill 255 while Dutch retreated with the rest of his squad. Pictures that shouldn't exist because the only witness was supposed to be dead. But Kowalski wasn't dead. Dutch's legs gave out. He collapsed into the metal chair as the truth hit him like shrapnel. Castro hadn't just been studying his CIA files. He'd been studying his entire life. The Cuban intelligence network had found Kowalski, interviewed him, documented every detail of that frozen morning when Dutch made the choice that would haunt him forever. Sometimes the greatest victory is letting your enemy think he's winning, Castro had scrawled across the final page. Patience, Colonel. The best lessons take time to develop. Morrison knocked again, harder this time. Colonel van der Berg? Sir, we need to debrief. Debrief. The word tasted bitter. What was there to debrief? That he'd been played by a communist revolutionary? That 18 months of psychological warfare had been nothing more than an elaborate chess game where Dutch never realized he was the pawn? He stood slowly, his joints protesting like an old man's, though he was only 37. The file felt impossibly heavy in his hands. Outside, palm trees swayed in the November heat, and somewhere across 90 miles of blue water, Fidel Castro was probably laughing. Dutch had built his reputation on reading people, on finding the psychological pressure points that could crack even the strongest minds. He'd broken Soviet agents turned defectors, planted seeds of doubt in enemy commanders that bloomed into full-scale rebellions. The CIA called him their secret weapon, the man who could wage war without firing a shot. But Castro had read him first. The realization settled in his chest like a tumor. Every report Dutch had filed, every strategy he'd developed, every weakness he thought he'd identified in Castro's psychological profile, it had all been fed to him. Castro had been the puppet master, pulling strings Dutch couldn't even see, turning his own expertise against him. Morrison's footsteps retreated down the hallway. Protocol demanded Dutch report this breach immediately, call in a full security review, initiate damage control procedures. Instead, he sat there staring at his own handwriting, now forever tainted by Castro's annotations. The worst part wasn't the professional humiliation. It wasn't even the security breach or the wasted months of operation planning. The worst part was the surgical precision with which Castro had exposed his deepest shame. Hill 255, Sergeant Kowalski. The choice between mission survival and personal honor that Dutch had buried so deep he'd convinced himself it never happened. But Castro knew. Castro had always known. The file contained one final item, a small note card with an address in Key West and a single sentence. "When you're ready to learn instead of teach, you know where to find me." Dutch struck a match and held it to the corner of the file. As his reports curled into ash, he realized his war with Castro wasn't ending. It was just beginning. But this time, he wouldn't be fighting to break his enemy's mind. He'd be fighting to reclaim his own. The flames consumed 18 months of failed psychological warfare, but they couldn't touch the truth Castro had burned into his soul. The hunter had always been the hunted. 25 years later, Dutch Vanderberg still woke up burning files in his dreams. The morning sun slanted through salt-stained windows of his Key West cottage, casting prison bar shadows across the scarred wooden floor. He sat on the edge of his bed, bare feet touching cool boards, watching dust motes drift like ash in the amber light. His hands, now liver-spotted and trembling slightly from too much bourbon and too little sleep, still remembered the heat of those flames in Miami, the way his own words had curled and blackened under Castro's surgical annotations. Outside, a mockingbird ran through its repertoire of stolen songs. Dutch listened to each perfect imitation and thought about mirrors, about hunters and hunted, about the terrible weight of being known by your enemies better than you know yourself. He'd fled to this coral rock in 1963, 6 months after burning that file, telling himself it was strategic retreat rather than surrender. The agency had accepted his resignation without question. Failed operations bred dangerous questions, and Dutch had become a question mark they couldn't afford to investigate. He'd taken his pension, his medals, and his shame to the southernmost point in America, as far from Castro as U.S. soil would allow, while still keeping the dictator visible on the horizon. The cottage belonged to his late wife's family, inherited when Clara died of cancer in 1979. She'd understood his nightmares without ever knowing their source, would stroke his graying hair when he woke gasping about Hill 255 or burning files or 3-minute speeches that could strip a man's soul bare. Clara had been his anchor to the ordinary world, proof that Marcus Vanderberg, not Dutch the psychological warfare specialist, not the decorated Korean war hero, just Marcus, could be loved for something other than his ability to break minds. Now the cottage felt too large and too small simultaneously, filled with her absence and his accumulated ghosts. Dutch pulled on yesterday's clothes, faded khakis and a fishing shirt that had seen better decades, and shuffled to the kitchen. The coffee maker gurgled to life, a comforting ritual that measured the distance between nightmare and wakefulness. Through the window above the sink, he could see his neighbor Mrs. Castellanos tending her garden, her weathered hands gentle with the hibiscus blooms. She'd brought him dinner 3 times this week, worried about the gringo who lived alone and spoke to his dead wife's photographs. The mail lay scattered by the front door where he'd dropped it yesterday, ignoring bills and advertisements in favor of bourbon and self-pity. But something made him look twice at the pile, a manila envelope with no return address, postmarked Havana. Dutch's coffee cup slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering against the tile floor in an explosion of porcelain and caffeine. His heart hammered against his ribs as he knelt to pick up the envelope, recognizing the precise handwriting that had haunted a quarter-century of sleepless nights. Colonel M. Vanderberg, 428 Petronia Street, Key West, FL 33040. The package felt heavier than it should, weighed down with terrible possibilities. Dutch carried it to Clara's rocking chair, the one piece of furniture that still smelled like her perfume, and sat holding the envelope like a live grenade. Through the thin walls he could hear life continuing around him, Mrs. Castellanos humming a Spanish lullaby, the distant sound of shrimp boats heading to port, children laughing as they rode bicycles to school. Normal sounds of a normal world where psychological warfare was something that happened to other people in other places. A world where Dutch had convinced himself he could disappear, could become just another broken-down veteran drinking away his memories in paradise. But Castro had found him. After 25 years of silence, the puppet master was pulling strings again. Dutch's thumb traced the envelope's edge, feeling the sharp paper like a blade against his skin. Inside could be anything. Photographs from Korea he'd never seen, recordings of classified debriefings, evidence of other operations Castro had manipulated from the shadows. Or perhaps something worse, proof that Dutch's entire life, from his first day at the agency to Clara's death, had been orchestrated by a communist revolutionary playing a game so deep and patient that Dutch couldn't even see the board. The mockingbird outside had moved on to imitating a cardinal's call, then a blue jay's harsh cry. Each stolen song perfect, each note a lie that sounded more real than truth. Dutch closed his eyes and felt the weight of the envelope, the weight of 25 years of running, the weight of questions he'd never had the courage to ask. Mrs. Castellanos called out a cheerful buenos dias to someone passing on the street. The sound of her voice, warm, innocent, unaware that her neighbor was holding correspondence from America's greatest enemy, made Dutch's chest tighten with protective fear. Whatever was in this envelope, whatever game Castro was playing, it couldn't touch the fragile peace of Petronia Street. Dutch wouldn't let his war follow him here, into this place where children rode bicycles and old women grew flowers and the past was supposed to stay buried. But his hands were already tearing at the seal. The envelope opened with a whisper, revealing contents that made Dutch's blood turn to ice water in his veins. Cassette tapes. 6 of them, labeled in that same precise handwriting. Soul debriefing sessions, 1951 to 1952. His own voice, captured on magnetic tape he'd thought was destroyed decades ago. But beneath the tapes lay something that stopped his heart completely. A photograph of Clara. Not Clara as he'd known her, gray-haired and gentle in Key West, but Clara at 22, standing outside the CIA recruitment office in Langley, 1960. A year before Dutch had been assigned the Castro operation. A year before they'd supposedly met by chance at that Georgetown coffee shop where she'd spilled rain from her umbrella onto his classified files. Dutch's hands shook so violently he nearly dropped the photograph. In the bottom right corner, Castro's handwriting, "Every good operation needs the right motivation. She was perfect for you, wasn't she?" The rocking chair tilted backward as Dutch struggled to breathe. Clara's perfume, still lingering in the fabric, now seemed cloying, false. Every memory he'd treasured, their first conversation about Hemingway, the way she'd laughed at his terrible jokes, how she'd held him through nightmares without asking questions, all of it recontextualized in an instant. She'd been an asset, a honey trap, a psychological pressure point disguised as love. Dutch fumbled for the first tape with nerveless fingers, jamming it into his old Sony player with desperate urgency. The speakers crackled to life, and his own voice emerged from 1951, young and cocky and stupid. "I left Kowalski because he was slowing down the unit. Command structure was clear. Mission objectives take precedence over individual casualties." Then another voice, clinical and detached. "But you could have saved him, Colonel. The North Koreans were still 2 clicks out." "Maybe. Probably. But I made a command decision." "Or you were afraid." A long pause on the tape, then his younger self, voice cracking. "Yes. God help me, yes, I was afraid." Dutch punched the stop button, but the damage was done. Those sessions had been classified at the highest levels, the tapes supposedly destroyed after his psychological evaluation was complete. But Castro had them. Had probably had them since 1960, maybe earlier. The photograph of Clara seemed to mock him from his trembling hands. How long had Castro been planning this? How many years had he spent studying Dutch's psychological profile, identifying his pressure points, crafting the perfect trap? The operation in Cuba hadn't been Dutch hunting Castro. It had been Castro positioning his prey exactly where he wanted him. Mrs. Castellanos's laughter drifted through the window, innocent and pure, and Dutch wanted to scream a warning. Run, he thought desperately. Get away from the poison that follows me everywhere. He forced himself to examine the remaining contents of the envelope. More photographs. Clara at CIA training facilities. Clara meeting with handlers Dutch had never seen. Clara receiving briefings about psychological warfare techniques. Each image time-stamped months before their chance encounter. At the bottom of the pile, a single sheet of paper with a message in English, the handwriting showing slight tremors that suggested advanced age. My dear Colonel, the student becomes the teacher, as you once taught me. Your Clara played her part beautifully, but love can grow even from deception. She protected you from the truth until her death, refused every contact we offered. Perhaps that tells you something about the heart versus the mind. Your war was never with me, Marcus. It was always with yourself. I am dying, and secrets die with men unless we choose to pass them on. One last lesson awaits, if you have the courage to learn it. The Marina, Slip 47. Tonight, when the moon sets, come alone, come armed, come ready to understand what you could never see. Your greatest enemy has always been your greatest teacher. FC. Dutch let the letter flutter to the floor as 25 years of carefully constructed reality collapsed around him. Clara, his anchor, his salvation, his proof that he could be more than a weapon, had been another move in Castro's infinite game. But the old revolutionary was right about one thing: love had grown from deception. Dutch had felt it in her touch, seen it in her eyes during those final days when cancer ate away everything but her fierce protection of his peace. She'd died keeping Castro's secrets, rather than destroy what little happiness Dutch had found. The mockingbird outside had gone quiet, as if sensing the earthquake reshaping the emotional landscape of Petronia Street. Dutch sat surrounded by the debris of his shattered assumptions, holding fragments of a life he'd thought was his own. His service revolver, unfired for 25 years, waited in the bedroom dresser drawer. Whatever Castro wanted to teach him at Slip 47, Dutch would go armed with more than just bullets. He'd carry the weight of every betrayal, every manipulation, every perfectly crafted lie that had shaped his existence. The war that began with burning files would finally end where all wars end. In truth, terrible and absolute. Dutch stared at Castro's letter until the words blurred together, his mind recoiling from the invitation like flesh from flame. Slip 47. Tonight. The Marina was 8 blocks away. He could walk there in 15 minutes, but the distance felt infinite. 25 years of hiding, of building walls around his shattered psyche, and now Castro wanted to tear them down with a conversation. He wouldn't go. Couldn't go. Dutch swept the photographs and tapes back into the envelope, his movements sharp and frantic. This was manipulation, pure and simple, the same psychological warfare he'd once practiced, turned against him by a master craftsman. Castro was dying, the letter said, but even from his deathbed the old revolutionary was pulling strings, orchestrating one final performance. The telephone sat on Clara's writing desk, black and patient. Dutch found himself dialing before conscious thought kicked in, muscle memory reaching 25 years into the past for a contact number that probably no longer existed: Langley Operations. The voice was crisp, professional, decades younger than Dutch felt. This is Colonel Marcus Vanderberg, retired. Authorization code Bravo 77 Charlie Mike. The words tasted rusty in his mouth. A pause. Computer keys clicking. Sir, that authorization expired in 1963. Transfer me to Morrison, Agent Dale Morrison. Sir, I don't show any. He was my handler. Miami Station, 1961 through 1963. Psychological Warfare Division. More clicking. Dutch's palms sweated against the plastic receiver. Morrison would be in his 70s now, if he was still alive. Probably retired to some golf course in Virginia, writing memoirs he could never publish. Sir? Agent Morrison died in 1978. Car accident outside Quantico. The receiver slipped from Dutch's nerveless fingers, dangling by its cord like a hanged man. Morrison dead. His anchor to the agency, to that world of secrets and shadows where Dutch had once been important, had been gone for almost a decade. He was alone with this. Dutch hung up and immediately dialed another number, the Key West Police Department. His finger hovered over the final digit before stopping. What would he tell them? That a communist dictator was threatening him through the mail? That he needed protection from a meeting he didn't have to attend? They'd think he was another drunk veteran losing his mind to the Florida heat. Besides, Castro had been right about one thing. Dutch had always been armed. The service revolver in his bedroom dresser had been cleaned and oiled every month for 25 years, a ritual of readiness for a war he'd hoped would never come. But going armed to meet Castro would mean acknowledging the meeting was real, that the game was still being played. Dutch slammed the phone down and stalked to the kitchen, pulling a bottle of bourbon from the cabinet with shaking hands. The first swallow burned away the taste of fear. The second steadied his nerves enough to think clearly. He could run, pack a bag, drain his savings account, disappear into the American heartland where Cuban intelligence networks couldn't reach, become someone else entirely, a farmer in Iowa, a shopkeeper in Montana, anything except the man Castro had been studying for 3 decades. The bourbon made the idea seem possible until Dutch caught sight of his reflection in the kitchen window. 62 years old, liver spots mapping the passage of time across his hands, gray hair thin enough to show scalp beneath. Where could a broken-down, spook run that his reputation wouldn't follow? What kind of life could he build on the foundation of cowardice? "You already tried hiding," Clara's voice whispered from memory. How well did that work? Dutch poured another bourbon and wandered through the cottage, touching objects that had once seemed solid and real. Clara's reading glasses on the nightstand, their wedding photograph on the mantel, the fishing rod he'd never learned to use because Dutch Vanderberg didn't fish. He interrogated, analyzed, manipulated. Every item now felt contaminated by possibility. Had Castro chosen Clara specifically because she'd appreciate Dutch's intellectual pretensions? Had their entire marriage been performance art, directed from Havana with patient precision? The mockingbird outside began imitating a phone ring, and Dutch nearly jumped out of his skin. His nerves were shot, his hands trembling with more than bourbon. This was what Castro wanted, to reduce him to a paranoid wreck, jumping at shadows and questioning every relationship he'd ever trusted. Mrs. Castellanos appeared at her garden gate, waving cheerfully. "Todo bien, Marcus?" Dutch forced a smile and waved back, but her innocent concern felt like acid in his chest. How many other people in his life might be assets? How deep did Castro's network run? The paranoia felt like drowning, each suspicion pulling him deeper into isolation until he couldn't trust his own memories. The envelope sat on Clara's rocking chair like a coiled snake, waiting for his decision. Inside, Castro's letter promised answers, closure, an end to the questions that had haunted Dutch for 25 years. But answers came with a price, and Dutch was no longer sure he could afford to pay it. The bourbon bottle was half empty when the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Dutch woke to darkness, his neck stiff from sleeping in Clara's rocking chair, the empty bourbon bottle rolling against his foot. The envelope had fallen to the floor. Castro's letter spread across the tiles like accusatory fingers. The clock on the mantelpiece read 11:47 p.m. Moonset was in 20 minutes. Too late, he thought with relief that immediately curdled into shame. Too late to make the choice. But his legs were already moving, carrying him toward the bedroom dresser where his service revolver waited. His hands found the weapon in complete darkness, muscle memory guiding fingers across familiar steel. The weight felt heavier than he remembered, loaded with more than bullets. Dutch made it 3 blocks toward the marina before the memories hit him like shrapnel. Seoul, 1951. Private Kowalski bleeding out in the snow while Dutch calculated angles, assessed risks, measured one life against mission success. The kid's eyes finding his across 30 yards of frozen ground, mouth forming words Dutch couldn't hear over the artillery. "Don't leave me." But Dutch had left him because the tactical manual said so, because command structure demanded it, because admitting fear would have meant admitting he wasn't the decorated hero everyone believed him to be. The marina came into view, a forest of masts swaying against stars. Slip 47 sat at the far end, shrouded in shadows that could hide anything. or anyone. Dutch's free hand pressed against his chest, feeling his heart hammer against ribs that suddenly felt too fragile to contain the pressure building inside. This was how Castro operated, not with grand gestures or revolutionary speeches, but with precision strikes against psychological pressure points identified decades in advance. The old bastard knew Dutch would come because he knew Dutch had never learned how to live with unanswered questions. "Coward," his father's voice whispered from the grave. "Decorated hero who can't face one dying old man." Dutch forced himself forward, each step an act of will against every survival instinct screaming retreat. Slip 47 materialized from the darkness, empty except for a small dinghy tied to weathered pilings. No Castro, no final confrontation. Just a folded piece of paper weighted down with a conch shell. "Marcus, you came armed, as expected, but the only enemy here is the one you brought with you. I am not in Key West, my friend. I am dying in Havana, as I have been dying for months, but I needed to know if you would find the courage to face the truth you have carried alone for 36 years. Private Kowalski, age 19, Birmingham, Alabama, died January 15, 1951, while his commanding officer calculated odds instead of saving lives. Your Clara spent 15 years protecting you from this guilt, redirecting our investigations, feeding us false intelligence about your psychological state. She loved you enough to betray her mission, to choose your peace over her duty. The tapes were real, Marcus. The pressure you felt was real. But love, even love born from deception, became real too. Some victories are worth the cost of losing everything else. Your war is over. Let it end. FC. Dutch's knees gave out, dropping him onto the damp pier planks. The letter fluttered from nerveless fingers as 36 years of carefully buried shame erupted from whatever psychological vault he'd locked it in. Kowalski's face, young and trusting and doomed, superimposed itself over the dark water. He'd been 19. Younger than Dutch's nephew, younger than the college kids who worked the fishing boats each summer. A kid from Birmingham who joined the army to see the world and instead found himself bleeding out in Korean snow while his CO weighed tactical options. Clara had known. Somehow she'd known about Kowalski, about the real reason Dutch woke screaming some nights, and instead of using that knowledge to destroy him, as Castro had undoubtedly intended, she'd chosen to protect him. For 15 years, she'd fed false intelligence to Cuban handlers, preserving the psychological shields Dutch needed to function. She'd betrayed Castro to love him, really love him, not just perform the part she'd been assigned. The service revolver felt impossibly heavy in Dutch's grip. One squeeze of the trigger could end the questions, the guilt, the terrible weight of understanding how many lives had been twisted around the black hole of his cowardice. Kowalski deserved justice. Clara deserved better than a husband who'd built their happiness on foundations of buried shame. But then he heard it, Mrs. Castellanos humming that Spanish lullaby as she worked late in her garden, tending flowers that bloomed despite the salt air and hurricane seasons. Life persisting, growing, choosing beauty over destruction even when destruction felt easier. Dutch lowered the weapon and let the tears come, 36 years of grief pouring out onto a pier that smelled of fish and diesel fuel, and the patient Gulf Stream carrying secrets between shores. He cried for Kowalski, for Clara, for the young soldier he'd been before fear taught him to measure love in tactical terms. Dawn was breaking over the Atlantic when Dutch finally stood, pockets heavy with Castro's letters and his own unfinished business. Dutch walked home through streets painted gold by early morning light, Castro's final letter burning against his chest like a brand. The cottage on Petronia Street looked smaller somehow, as if the revelation at the marina had shifted the fundamental architecture of his world. He climbed the front steps with legs that felt disconnected from his body, muscle memory carrying him through motions that no longer seemed to belong to him. Inside, the scattered photographs and tapes waited exactly where he'd left them, evidence of a psychological operation that had consumed 3 decades of his life. But now, in the harsh clarity of dawn, Dutch saw something he'd missed in his initial panic, the dates. His hands trembled as he arranged the surveillance photos chronologically. Clara at CIA training facilities, dated 1959, 2 years before their meeting. Clara receiving psychological warfare briefings, 1960. Clara studying Dutch's military records and psychiatric evaluations, early 1961. Then, something changed. The later photographs showed different body language, different expressions. Clara arguing with her handlers. Clara walking away from meetings. Clara, in one blurred shot clearly taken without her knowledge, burning documents in what looked like a hotel room ashtray. And then, abruptly, the surveillance stopped. The final photograph was dated December 1962. Clara sitting alone at a Miami cafe, staring directly at the camera with an expression Dutch now recognized as defiance. She'd gone rogue. Not immediately, not all at once, but gradually, systematically, choosing him over them. Castro's letter had been true about that much. Clara had spent 15 years protecting Dutch from the very people who'd sent her to destroy him. Dutch sank into her rocking chair, holding the evidence of her betrayal and her salvation in shaking hands. Every memory of their marriage now carried double weight, the woman who'd been assigned to study his weaknesses, and the woman who'd chosen to guard them instead. Both versions were real. Both versions were Clara. The mockingbird outside began its morning symphony, cycling through stolen songs with mechanical precision. For 25 years, Dutch had found comfort in that sound. Nature's own psychological warfare, one creature mimicking others so perfectly that prey couldn't distinguish predator from friend. He understood now why Clara had never asked about his nightmares, never pushed when he woke screaming Kowalski's name. She'd already known. She'd studied the transcripts of his Korean War debriefings, read the classified psychiatric evaluations that documented his guilt over abandoning a dying soldier. Her tenderness hadn't been spontaneous. It had been informed, precise, surgical in its effectiveness. But did that make it less real? Dutch remembered her final weeks, the way cancer had stripped everything non-essential from her personality until only the core remained. She'd been delirious with morphine when she grabbed his wrist with surprising strength and whispered, "I kept you safe. Promise me you'll let yourself be happy." At the time, he'd thought she meant safe from loneliness, safe from the depression that had nearly claimed him before their marriage. But she'd meant safe from Castro, safe from the psychological pressure that would have destroyed him if he'd known the truth about Kowalski while still trying to break the Cuban leader's mind. The telephone rang, startling Dutch from his reverie. The clock read 7:23 a.m., too early for social calls, too late for emergencies. He let it ring 4 times before answering with a voice that sounded like sandpaper. "Marcus?" The accent was Cuban, but not one he recognized. Female, elderly, careful with her English. "My name is Carmen Herrera. I was Fidel's secretary for many years." Dutch's blood turned to ice water. "How did you get this number?" "Senor Castro asked me to call you this morning. He wanted you to know that he died last night, peacefully, at 3:17 Havana time. His final words were about you, Marcus. He said to tell you that the war is over and that both sides won something worth keeping." The receiver fell from Dutch's hand, clattering against the wall as he processed the information. Castro was dead, the architect of 30 years of psychological manipulation, the man who'd orchestrated Clara's entire existence, had drawn his last breath while Dutch was crying on a pier in Key West. But that meant the voice on the phone, this Carmen Herrera, was lying. Castro couldn't have given her instructions last night. The letter at the marina had been written weeks ago, maybe months. This was another layer of the operation, another mind game extending beyond the grave. Unless... Dutch retrieved the phone with hands that barely functioned. "Who are you really?" A long pause. Then, in a voice suddenly free of Cuban accent, someone who loved him enough to tell the lies he needed to hear. Just like your Clara loved you enough to tell the lies you needed to hear. Goodbye, Marcus. Some wars end when the warriors choose to lay down their weapons. The line went dead, leaving Dutch alone with the terrible understanding that he would never know where Castro's manipulation ended and genuine human connection began. Perhaps that had always been the point. Dutch stood frozen in his kitchen, the dead receiver still pressed against his ear like a seashell promising distant oceans. The dial tone droned on, mechanical and indifferent, while his mind struggled to process what had just happened. Castro was dead. The grand architect of this psychological chess match had left the board while Dutch was still trying to understand the rules. But the woman, Carmen, or whoever she really was, had spoken of love. Love twisted through deception until the two became indistinguishable, like DNA strands spiraling around each other in patterns too complex to untangle. His legs carried him to the living room where Clara's photograph smiled from the mantelpiece, frozen in perpetual youth. The surveillance photos lay scattered beneath her image like fallen leaves, documenting the slow transformation from operative to wife, from mission to love. Dutch picked up one of the later shots, Clara walking away from her handlers, shoulders squared in defiance. "You chose me," he whispered to the photograph. "After everything, you chose me." But even that certainty felt fragile now. What if her defection had been planned too? What if Castro had calculated that Dutch would be more thoroughly broken by discovering genuine love than by remaining isolated? The paranoia felt like quicksand, each attempt to find solid ground only pulling him deeper into doubt. The morning sun climbed higher, throwing long shadows across the cottage floor. Mrs. Castellanos was already in her garden, humming that Spanish lullaby while tending her roses. The normalcy of it, flowers blooming, neighbors gardening, life continuing despite the psychological earthquakes reshaping his reality, felt both comforting and surreal. Dutch walked to his bedroom and opened the dresser drawer where his service revolver waited. The weapon looked smaller in daylight, less ominous than it had seemed during his midnight walk to the marina. Just steel and gunpowder. Simple tools that couldn't solve the complex equations of love and deception Castro had left behind. Next to the gun lay his other relic from the war, a tarnished silver medal he'd never worn, never displayed, never spoken about. The Distinguished Service Cross, awarded for actions in Korea that the citation described as extraordinary heroism in the face of overwhelming enemy forces. The same action where he'd left Kowalski to die. Dutch lifted the medal, feeling its familiar weight. The citation was a masterpiece of military euphemism, transforming calculated abandonment into tactical brilliance. Colonel Vanderberg's decisive leadership and strategic thinking preserved the lives of 47 soldiers under his command. What it didn't mention was the 48th soldier, bleeding out in the snow while Dutch chose the greater good over individual conscience. The medal was why Castro had targeted him in the first place, not for his skills as a psychological warrior. Those had developed later, shaped by guilt into weapons of precision. Castro had seen the fundamental contradiction at Dutch's core, a decorated hero whose heroism was built on a foundation of moral cowardice. The perfect pressure point for a master manipulator to exploit, but Clara had seen it too, and instead of exploiting it, she'd chosen to heal it. 15 years of protection, of creating a safe space where Dutch could exist without confronting the truth about himself. She'd weaponized love instead of guilt, turned her mission into mercy. The telephone rang again. Dutch stared at it for 6 rings before answering. "Colonel Vanderberg?" The voice was American official, carefully modulated. "This is Deputy Director Harrison, CIA. I believe we need to talk." Dutch's throat closed. After 30 years of silence, after Morrison's death, after convincing himself he'd been forgotten by the agency, they were calling. "I'm retired. Sir, we're aware that you've been contacted by Cuban intelligence assets. We need to debrief you on any information that may have been compromised." The irony was suffocating. They wanted to protect him from the very manipulation that had already shaped 30 years of his life. Dutch looked at Castro's letters, at the surveillance photos documenting Clara's transformation, at the evidence of psychological warfare that had turned love into a weapon and weapons into love. "There's nothing to debrief," Dutch said quietly. "The operation is over, has been for a long time. Sir, we have reports suggesting—" Dutch hung up and immediately unplugged the phone from the wall. Whatever the agency thought they knew, whatever reports had triggered their interest, it was too late. The real war had been fought in the spaces between truth and deception, in the possibility that love could exist even when born from lies. Outside, the mockingbird continued its symphony of stolen songs, each note a perfect imitation of something else. Dutch understood now why Clara had loved that sound. It represented the possibility that borrowed things could become genuine, that performance could transform into truth through the simple act of repetition. The war was over. Both sides had won something worth keeping. Now he had to decide what to do with his half of the victory. The silence that followed Dutch's decision stretched like the space between lightning and thunder. pregnant with consequence, electric with possibility. He stared at the unplugged phone cord dangling against the wall like a severed nerve, realizing that cutting contact with the agency meant cutting his last tie to the man he'd been before Key West, before Clara, before the terrible understanding that his entire adult life had been choreographed by forces beyond his comprehension. But in that silence, something else emerged, the sound of his own breathing, steady and deliberate. For the first time in 36 years, Dutch wasn't waiting for orders, wasn't calculating angles, wasn't performing the role of decorated hero or psychological warrior or grieving widower. He was simply Marcus Vanderberg, sitting in a cottage that smelled of salt air and old memories, holding evidence of a love that had transcended its own deception. The Distinguished Service Cross caught morning light from his dresser, its tarnished surface reflecting fractured rainbows. Dutch picked up the medal and walked outside, feeling the Gulf breeze carry away the stale air of his self-imposed prison. Mrs. Castellanos looked up from her roses, offering the gentle smile she'd shared every morning for 15 years. "Buenos dias, Marcus. You look different today." He did feel different, lighter somehow, as if the weight of Castro's final revelation had burned away everything non-essential, leaving only the core of who he might choose to become. "Mrs. Castellanos, may I ask you something?" She straightened, wiping soil from weathered hands. "Of course, mi amor. Did you know Clara before she married me? In Miami, perhaps?" The elderly woman's expression flickered just for a moment, with something that might have been recognition. Then she smiled, the same warm expression she'd worn for 15 years. "I knew Clara as your wife, Marcus. That is all anyone needs to know about love, verdad? What matters is not how it begins, but how it grows." Dutch understood then that Mrs. Castellanos had been placed here too, another guardian in Castro's elaborate design to protect him from truths he couldn't handle. But like Clara, she'd transcended her assignment, becoming genuinely fond of the broken man next door. The manipulation had evolved into authentic affection through the simple alchemy of time and proximity. "You're right," Dutch said softly. "What matters is how it grows." He walked to the end of Petronia Street, where the cemetery stretched toward the water in neat rows of coral rock and weathered marble. Clara's grave sat beneath a royal poinciana tree she'd loved for its defiant beauty, how it bloomed most brilliantly during hurricane season, painting the sky orange when everything else sought shelter. Dutch knelt beside her headstone and placed the Distinguished Service Cross on the sun-warmed stone. "I understand now," he whispered. "You knew about Kowalski, knew about the guilt that was eating me alive, and you chose to heal it instead of exploit it. You made love into a weapon against the darkness." The wind rustled through the poinciana's branches, shedding a few late-season blossoms onto the grave. Dutch gathered them carefully, orange petals soft as tissue paper, beautiful in their fragility. "I can't bring him back," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "Can't undo the choice I made in Korea. Can't resurrect the 19-year-old boy from Birmingham who deserved better from his commanding officer. But I can stop letting his death poison everything good that came after. I can honor both truths, that I failed him and that you saved me." The confession felt like surgery performed without anesthesia, necessary, excruciating, ultimately healing. Dutch had spent 36 years believing that acknowledging his failure would diminish his capacity to love or be loved. But Clara had known better. She'd understood that guilt unexpressed became toxic, while guilt acknowledged could be transformed into wisdom, compassion, the hard-won knowledge that came from surviving moral complexity. A brown pelican landed on a nearby monument, regarding Dutch with ancient, knowing eyes. The bird reminded him of Castro somehow, patient, calculating, willing to wait motionless for exactly the right moment to strike, but also graceful in its own way, following instincts honed by millions of years of evolution toward survival. Dutch stood and dusted coral fragments from his knees, feeling the subtropical sun warm his face. In the distance, fishing boats were heading out for the day's work, their captains trusting the same Gulf Stream that had carried messages between enemies and lovers for 30 years. The water looked impossibly blue, unchanged by the human dramas played out along its shores. Walking home, Dutch made mental lists of the tasks ahead. Pack the surveillance photos away, not to forget, but to remember on his own terms. Plant something in Clara's garden, perhaps those orange bird-of-paradise flowers she'd always admired but never gotten around to buying. Call Morrison's nephew and offer to share stories about the old spook's better qualities. Most importantly, learn to live with the truth that love and deception could coexist, that healing could emerge from manipulation, that former enemies could recognize each other's humanity across the narrow straits that separated their shores. Castro was dead, but his final lesson remained. Some victories were worth the cost of losing everything else. The war finally was over. The cottage felt different when Dutch returned, larger somehow, as if removing the weight of secrets had expanded the walls themselves. Sunlight streamed through windows that Clara had insisted on keeping uncurtained, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the warming air. For 30 years, he'd seen those floating particles as evidence of decay, of time's relentless passage through their shared space. Now they looked like celebration. Dutch moved through the rooms with newfound purpose, gathering the surveillance photographs into neat stacks. These would go into the cedar chest beside Clara's wedding dress, not hidden, but preserved as artifacts of a love story too complex for simple telling. Future archaeologists of their marriage would find layers of truth, each more nuanced than the last, like core samples from some exotic emotional geology. In the kitchen, he brewed coffee using Clara's method, strong enough to wake the dead, sweet enough to forgive them their sins. The ritual felt sacred, a communion with the woman who'd taught him that performed gestures could become genuine through repetition. How many mornings had she stood at this same counter, preparing breakfast while secretly protecting him from psychological warfare he didn't know was being waged? The magnitude of her dual existence staggered him. The unplugged telephone sat like a discarded snakeskin on the side table. Dutch had no intention of reconnecting it. Whatever the agency wanted, whatever debriefing they deemed necessary, belonged to a version of himself that had died with Castro. Marcus Vanderberg, psychological warfare specialist, had been laid to rest in a cemetery of coral and Spanish moss. What remained was something simpler, more essential, a man learning to live with complexity. Mrs. Castellanos appeared at the kitchen window, holding a plate covered with checkered cloth. Dutch opened the door before she could knock, accepting her offering with hands that no longer shook. Café Cubano and fresh bread. The same peace offering she'd brought every morning since Clara's funeral. "You seem at peace today, mi amor," she observed, studying his face with the careful attention of someone trained to read emotional weather. "It is good to see." "Peace might be too strong a word," Dutch replied, breathing in the coffee's dark sweetness. "But I'm not at war anymore either. That has to count for something." She nodded with the wisdom of someone who'd survived multiple exile, who understood that healing rarely arrived as dramatic revelation but rather as gradual acceptance. "Clara would be proud," she said simply. "She worried about you, you know. Worried that her secrets would destroy what she was trying to protect." The admission confirmed what Dutch had already suspected, that Mrs. Castellanos had been confidant as well as neighbor, keeper of truths too dangerous for him to carry alone. But like Clara, she'd evolved from operative to friend, choosing loyalty over mission parameters. "Did you know him?" Dutch asked. "Castro? I knew many men like him," she answered carefully. "Brilliant, ruthless, capable of great cruelty and unexpected mercy. Men who understood that the heart could be conquered more completely than any territory." She paused, considering her words. "But I think, at the end, he envied what you and Clara found together. Love that began as strategy but became real through choice." Dutch spent the afternoon in Clara's garden, hands deep in rich soil that she'd amended with coffee grounds and crushed shells. The earth felt alive beneath his fingers, warm with decomposed secrets and patient hope. He planted the bird-of-paradise flowers, their orange blooms defiant as flags of surrender, beautiful as forgiveness. As evening approached, he returned to the pier where Castro's final letter had found him. The water stretched endlessly toward Cuba, carrying currents that connected enemies and lovers with democratic indifference. Fishing boats were returning now, their hulls heavy with the day's catch, their captains navigating by stars that belonged to no nation. A young couple sat nearby, sharing a bottle of wine and whispered conversation in Spanish. They reminded Dutch of himself and Clara during their early years. intense, secretive, bound by forces they couldn't fully articulate. But unlike his marriage, their love appeared uncomplicated by geopolitics and psychological warfare, innocent of the elaborate choreography that had defined his relationship. Or perhaps not. Perhaps every love story contained hidden depths, secret missions, elaborate strategies disguised as spontaneous affection. Perhaps the miracle wasn't that Clara had been assigned to study him, but that she'd chosen to love him despite, or because of, what she'd discovered in the classified files of his deepest shames. The Mockingbird began its evening concert, cycling through borrowed songs with mechanical precision. But tonight, Dutch heard something different in the performance. Not mimicry, but interpretation. Each stolen melody transformed into something new through the act of repetition, until the artificial became authentic through sheer persistence. Dutch pulled Castro's letters from his pocket, reading them one final time in the dying light. Then, without ceremony, he tore them into pieces and scattered the fragments on the water. The Gulf Stream would carry them away, mixing Cuban secrets with Key West confessions until both became part of something larger. The endless circulation of stories between shores, the patient current that connected all seekers of impossible victories. The war was over. What remained was the harder work of learning how to live with what they'd won.